This is Hacker Public Radio episode 3439 for Thursday, the 7th of October 2021. Today's show is entitled Linux Inlaws S01E40, the one with the BSDs. It is the 40th show of Monochromic and is about 97 minutes long and carries an explicit flag. The summary is the other one operating system to rule them all.
This episode of HPR is brought to you by archive.org. Support universal access to all knowledge by heading over to archive.org/donate.
This is Linux Inlaws, a podcast on topics around free and open source software, any associated contraband, communism, the revolution in general, and whatever fancies you tickle. Please note that this and other episodes may contain strong language, offensive humor, and other certainly not politically correct language. You have been warned. Our parents insisted on this disclaimer. Happy Mom? Thus, the content is not suitable for consumption in the workplace, especially when played back in an open plan office or similar environments. Any minors under the age of 35 or any pets including fluffy little killer bunnies, your trusty guide dog, unless on speed, and cute T-Rexes or other associated dinosaurs. This is Linux Inlaws, Season 1, Episode 40. The one with the BSDs. Good evening, Martin. How are things?
Hey, Chris. Things are fine, if slightly on the warm side for the UK.
Yeah, I heard
I hear you have some water in your direction.
Yes, indeed, very much so. I think, we have a little bit too much of water running around, and apparently you still have to turn down the heating in the UK.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. But this is not a show about weather for some strange reason. This is a show about open source software. And tonight we have a special treat because we do have a selected panel of BSD people on the show. So without further ado, why don't we do a short intro round? Dan, why don't you go first?
Hi, my name's Dan Langell. I got involved with open source software in about, I think it was 1995. Someone gave me some free BSD CDs and an old computer, and that got me a firewall because I'd just gotten ADSL, and things have just gone downhill from there.
Mark, you're next.
Hey, sorry about the accent. I'm French, in case this isn't apparent. I'm Mark SP, so I've been working with OpenBSD since 1998. I've been dabbling in open source software for a bit longer, and at that point I got an Amiga and I wanted to install something on it, and the only operating system with decent installation instruction was OpenBSD, and the rest is history, as they say.
Patrick.
I had been using Linux for about 9 years. I started using OpenBSD 4 years ago. I think the main reason I was ever interested in exploring other operating systems is just finding an interface that I was happy with.
I see.
So that just about sums me up.
A true defector on the show. We love this. Nia, you're next.
Hi, my name is Nia Alari. I've been a NetBSD developer for the past 3 years. I've been using NetBSD for the past 6 years, and I work on some quite strange and diverse areas of the system, probably mostly known for my work on the audio stack and graphics related things.
And last but not least, Martin, my co-host, how did you come to BSD, Mr. Visser?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, BSD is obviously something from my university days, which is many, many, many years ago. But yeah, not forgotten. Let's put it that way. What about yourself, Chris?
Perfect. I actually came across BSD when I was still almost a child, for want of a better expression. We had a BSD system running in the Polytech where I did my first degree, but you're talking about at least 30 years back. I've been using FreeBSD, as a matter of fact, for about 10 years in the shape, shock and awe, of an operating system called macOS. But we're going to go into these details in a minute. Before we kind of discuss this kind of thing on a more technical level, what would the current, well, maybe we should shed some more light basically before we go into the details. We should shed some light on the history of BSD in terms of, initially there was System 5, that was the primeval, I'm tempted to say, Unix system back in the 60s, late 60s, I might add. And then the Berkeley Software Distribution came along, and then we arrived at OpenBSD, FreeBSD, NetBSD, DragonflyBSD, and I'm sure that I forgot a few BSD flavors. So volunteers first, who can talk about the history of BSD? Or who wants to talk about the history of BSD?
Well, I can do some parts. There is some stuff that I know about, but I haven't actually lived. Which is the origin of BSD, which is basically, as far as I know, Thomson went on sabbatical from Bell Labs at the time, and he came to Berkeley and he worked with people there, and they started this thing, which was BSD, and it became 386 BSD a few years later as the first try of being an open source software, but it didn't quite work because there were still parts that were actually owned by Bell Labs, and so lawsuit problems ensued, and this gave a little gap where a guy in Finland called Linus Torvalds managed to sneak in and create Linux, more or less. And when the lawsuit was resolved and the parts which were missing were actually written, I think that was when FreeBSD started. So I leave people from FreeBSD to talk about that. At about the same point, some people decided to port it to other platforms. This was the origin of NetBSD. Among NetBSD developers, there was this guy called Theodoret, which had something of a temper. And it ended up in a fight between Theo and the other people, the other founding favors of NetBSD, let's say. And Theo got outed from the project, and he decided to found his own project, which is how OpenBSD started.
Interesting.
Well,
all these different BSD flavors, and of course there's also Dragonfly BSD, which we may go into in a minute. All these different BSD flavors, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and NetBSD, have different kind of focus areas. If my fading memory rather is anything to go by, maybe somebody from the panel basically, or due to the fact that we have actually different panel members of the different flavors on the recording session, why don't we kind of shed some more light on the focus areas of these different flavors of the BSD operating system?
I actually use FreeBSD at work quite a lot, despite working on NetBSD in my free time. And from my perspective, FreeBSD is marketed much more towards like high performance server usage. Even though the other BSDs are good choices for that as well. But at work, we actually use it for embedded devices, and NetBSD is also a great choice for that and has lots of tooling for working on embedded devices and routers and things like that. And I think NetBSD has kind of an interesting history of being focused on supporting lots of platforms, but also just as a platform for research and interesting ideas. And it's achieved a quite good balance of performance, security, as well as having some very, very unique and interesting design decisions like rump, for example.
What is rump?
Rump is a kind of model for how kernels can be almost dissected, I suppose. It's possible to run parts of the NetBSD kernel in user space or on bare metal. For bare metal applications, you can use NetBSD drivers, or I think the GNU Herd people were looking into using NetBSD drivers in their microkernel just by using a NetBSD rump kernel as a service. And it's quite a unique design, and I don't think there's anything else quite like it that exists, as far as I'm aware.
So it's not a true microkernel, it's more like a hybrid approach?
I suppose it's a monolithic kernel that's also a library operating system.
Wow. Okay. Given the fact that library operating systems are, I reckon not everybody in the dear and cherished listenership is an operating system expert. Maybe we should explain what library operating systems are. Somebody volunteering from the audience, or should I basically take a shot at it? Okay.
I'd be interested in seeing what you have to say.
Okay, in that case, yeah. Let me make a few mistakes, and then you can correct me and fill in the gaps. Library operating systems. Essentially, you take a small kernel-like structure, as in code base, and package the operating system on top of it, meaning that normally an operating system is divided into kernel user space. A library operating system basically has the operating system services co-located to the application. Library operating systems typically do not differentiate between the kernel and the user space, leaving the door wide open to all sorts of interesting and funny security challenges, I suppose. Let's put it this way. But library operating systems do have a few advantages. For example, you do not have a context switch between user and kernel space. The packaging can be quite compact and dense because you are essentially building a full application stack, including the operating system, just for one purpose. So library operating systems have found quite a significant following, I'm tempted to say, in the area of embedded systems, where you typically have only one app running on your OS stack. Now, where did I go wrong?
I think that's a very good explanation. I would also add that with something like rump, there's the ability to use parts of the kernel as a user space application. So, for example, you can use the file system drivers to mount a file system without touching the kernel at all, really. And also, there's quite a large test suite for NetBSD that takes heavy advantage of this by running device drivers and so on as rump servers in user space to test them.
No, in that case, I reckon that this is quite significant in the embedded space, because that is typically the area where library operating systems and unikernels are used in, if memory serves correct.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I think the biggest use of rump currently is as a testing tool, just to ensure the continued stability and reliability of the operating system, I suppose.
Okay. Now, speaking of embedded systems, that has typically been a domain for something called Linux. The Raspberry Pis of the world and other single-board computers typically run some sort of Linux operating system. Is there any opinion on the panel with regards to the BSD penetration of the sector? And I'm almost tempted to say that there is, of course, another embedded space called mobile, where, funny enough, FreeBSD has gained a significant following, although I reckon not many people know it. Because if they're using something called iOS, essentially they're using a small microkernel which with a stripped down FreeBSD personality on top of it, called QNX or something. Not QNX, sorry, I'm lacking the acronym here, but it's essentially something based on something called Apple called Darwin, if I'm not completely mistaken.
I think parts of QNX are using the NetBSD networking stack. I mean, if you look in their copyright statements, there's a lot of NetBSD Foundation copyrights, and I think iOS is probably mostly FreeBSD, but there's bits from everywhere in there probably, especially if you go digging deep into where every single tool comes from.
Same goes for, I reckon, generally speaking, same goes for Darwin, generally speaking, or the foundation of something called OS X. And needless to say, this goes back to something called NextOS. Martin, we do not have Claudia on the show, do we?
Not today, no. We keep trying.
Unfortunately, we don't, no. Martin, you wanna shed some light on NextOS and the history, or maybe I should do this?
No, you go for it.
Yes.
But since we don't have Claudia, you're the best second one. Sure.
Thank you. No, I mean, there is, of course, something called NextOS that a certain guy called Steve Jobs came about, or kind of invented, whatever you want to call it, or came up with, rather. It's probably the best expression. When Steve basically left Apple, or had to leave Apple for want of a better expression, in the mid-'80s, he set out and founded a company called Next. The idea was to provide education systems, pretty much, based on an open source stack to the masses. Hence, this Next Cube was born, and it was running something called NextOS. So what Steve and the engineers did was essentially take a microkernel in the shape of Mark 2.5 or 3, I can't even remember, put a FreeBSD personality on top of it, and put on top of that stack a windowing system and some other components. So after a few years, Apple decided to buy Next Computers, or whatever the name of the company was at the time. So Steve Jobs was reinstantiated as a CEO, and pretty much so OS X, what we know now as macOS, was born. And over the last 30 years, that hasn't really changed. I mean, you have different CPU architectures. I mean, the first one was PowerPC, then Apple moved to Intel, and now they are back to RISC architecture called Apple Silicon, which essentially is an ARM core, heavily customized, of course, but still running OS X as it used to be on the lower layers back then. So Apple actually has gone full circle here. And if you take a look at, as we just discussed, at iOS, essentially it's a stripped down version of OS X. So going back to the embedded space, to my original question, many people actually use BSD without knowing it, given the fact that indeed the rest is pretty much Linux dominated. What is the panel's opinion about BSD in the embedded space, and where do you see this going?
I think there is something that needs to be said about licensing issues there. Because basically, unless I'm mistaken, I let the other people in the panel voice their own opinion. One reason we stick with the BSD is not only because of technical issues, but because we do believe in free software where you can take your piece of software and use it anywhere, including commercial products. And that's a good point on some aspects, and that's a bad point on some other aspects.
The big difference between BSD as permissive licensing and something like copyleft licensing, of course, as probably the majority of our listeners do know, Linux is licensed under something called GPL, public license, whereas in the BSD operating system family is licensed under either 2 or 3 clause BSD, which happens to be a permissive license. So without going into the details, because there was a show recently on set licensing issues done by us, the main difference is basically that the BSD license prescribe anything, and hence the term permissive license, because as Mark rightly pointed out, you can do pretty much whatever you want with the code, whereas in the GNU public license, alongside any similar copyleft license, actually prescribes a couple of things, namely, for example, that you have to publish any modifications that you made to the code base. So you are obliged to publish, to make the source code available of your code base once you've touched GPL license code base. That is, of course, not the case with the more permissive licenses like the BSDs, because these licenses typically just say you have to give the original author credit, you have to incorporate a copy of the license, and that's pretty much it. Apart from that, you're pretty much free to do whatever you want with the code. Any other opinions on the embedded space before we move on?
I don't really like talking about licensing too much because it's quite a controversial subject and people get very upset with you. But I think in my ideal world, everything would be public domain, but we don't live in my ideal world. And I'd also just add that if you look up the history of GPL enforcement, in particular, a name I would look for is Robert Landley, who worked on BusyBox. His opinion was, after suing lots of different companies over the GPL, he didn't get any useful code out of them. It was mostly just terrible stuff. I would add something on the more technical side of the embedded space, say in the ARM world. In Linux on ARM, there's lots of like custom vendor kernels and things like that a lot of people are very upset over and I think are very buggy and bad. And I'd just say, in the BSD world, that kind of doesn't exist. Everything is mainline. Everything is in the mainline kernel.
What exactly does that mean?
I suppose that everything is developed and integrated into one tree, and the contribution process is generally not very difficult. Like, I've heard some absolute horror stories where it's taken years for patches to be accepted into the Linux kernel. I'd like to think that we're a bit better at that.
Isn't it called the loadable kernel modules is what Linux supports? I know at least one. I know OpenBSD doesn't support those, but I think that is what kind of makes things like proprietary NVIDIA drivers possible. Whereas OpenBSD possibly the same with the other BSDs, but I know OpenBSD isn't really kind of. There's no technical facility, or it's not engineered to kind of really allow that kind of deep system integration, driver, third-party drivers like that.
I think
something like that.
Modules are used much more often on FreeBSD. On NetBSD, they're quite well supported, but mostly everything is in the main kernel binary, and you only use modules for things like Linux compatibility would be a good example. You have to load the Linux compatibility module if you want to use that.
Now, that's a very interesting subject. Maybe you can elaborate on that, because yes, BSD does support a Linux compatibility layer.
But it's a thing that exists in FreeBSD and NetBSD, although I think the implementations are quite different, and it's just
okay.
It's just a layer that can translate Linux syscalls to BSD syscalls. It's fairly straightforward, really. I think,
including fancy stuff like control groups and namespaces.
I think for my purposes, when I'm using Linux compatibility, I'm using it to play games. I don't know too much about the more advanced side of things there.
The reason why I'm asking, because these are the two control mechanisms that allow something called containers to run on Linux. Because these are the kernel mechanisms you need. BSD systems, and correct me if I'm wrong, have something similar called jails?
Yeah, jails are a FreeBSD thing. The other BSDs mostly just have virtual machines currently, is my understanding. I hear Lumos supports Linux containers.
I can talk about FreeBSD jails for days.
Give us the abridged version, please.
Basically, pardon me, FreeBSD jails have been around for about at least 10 years. Others can correct me. They're built into FreeBSD. They're designed for you to be. Their original purpose was to allow someone to run different versions of the same web server all on the same host. Instead of having to have 10 hosts, you could put them all on one host, for example. And what I do with it in one example is I run regression testing. So I have, I think, 7 jails. Each one is running a different version of Postgres or MySQL. They could be running different versions of FreeBSD if I wanted to. But basically, I run all that regression testing in a jail. The easy way to think of a jail is it's an elaborate CH root. So it's not actually true virtualization, but basically when you're in the jail, you can't tell you're in a jail, but you can if you look in certain spots. Basically, I treat a jail as a complete FreeBSD instance, and I put in that jail things that I want to run in there and have it completely isolated from everything else. Another interesting thing about jails when you're an admin is if you're the sysadmin of the host, you can see everything in every jail. If you do PS, for example, you see all the processes running in every jail, or you can pick one jail and see only the processes in that jail, which means theoretically that if you have a break-in into a jail, you can see everything they're doing in the jail, but they can't see you at all. They have no concept of anything outside the jail whatsoever. So
Okay.
Think of a jail as being a light virtualization, but it's not virtualization.
Yes, because the beauty with containers is actually you can limit their resource usage. So, for example, you can tell a container running on Linux basically only use so many CPU slices.
Yep.
You can confine their main memory. You can basically control their usage and all the rest of it. So these are the main difference between the change root environment and a true container.
You can limit CPU in a jail.
You can, okay.
Yes, and you can say, use this one CPU, and that's it. You're not using any other CPU. I think there are other controls you can add to the jail, but I don't do it because I've never needed to.
Okay.
Someone else might be able to elaborate on that.
Anybody using jails?
Not really, but you're off by about 10 years. Basically, I just looked it up, and the initial paper from Paul Camp was dated back from 2000. It's been around for 20 years now.
Wow.
20 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I was wrong. Way wrong.
Interesting.
To give you an idea, I've got, I think, 8 hosts and probably 80 jails spread amongst those hosts. I tend to put my database servers in a jail. I tend to put individual websites into a jail if they're self-contained. I have one server that's running 2 web servers, each one in a different jail, because one is running Nginx and the other one's running Apache.
Right.
Go
But
ahead.
jails are persistent, as in everything that you write to the file system in a jail stays where it is, whereas containers basically use something called, for example, a unifile system, which is by definition ephemeral. So if you stop a container, unless you explicitly mount it, for example, an external mount point to a container in terms of basically you make a portion of your file system visible inside the container. Every other change inside the container is lost. So you stop the container, you have no persistence enabled, the container and its data is gone. Unlike jails, I understand.
You could design a jail like that by having it by using ZFS, and I think many people are running jails on ZFS. It's much easier. You just give each jail their own ZFS file system, and what you could do is when you stop the jail, you do a rollback on the system it was using. You're back to where you started. You can do that with a clone, and then just roll it back to where you were when you started. Okay. You haven't lost anything. Sorry, you've lost everything that was in the jail, but you still have the original file system that you started from.
Which nicely leads us to very important topics: file systems on BSD. Any takers?
I just wanted to add about the running multiple databases thing at the same time. Well, multiple database versions, I suppose. And I think that was originally the reason jails were developed for FreeBSD. But it's kind of strange from a NetBSD perspective, because the package manager kind of allows doing that without any operating system level isolation. It's all done in the package manager. Sorry, I just wanted to add that there.
I think you're talking about Postgres there, and we had that problem on FreeBSD for a while, but I think it's gotten much better. It's actually installing them into different directories, and I haven't tried it lately, but yeah, I do run Postgres in different jails.
I think that's the point to be made here. That is that we are talking about actually different operating systems, but you're focusing on the kernel. But all the BSD are usually a full operating system with some differences. Like, for instance, NetBSD has got their own package manager with some kind of virtualization, if I remember correctly, some views, if that's still the term that you're using. And we have some stuff that's been developed in userland in OpenBSD, like OpenSSH, for instance. And in most cases, if you only look at the kernel and the specificities of the kernel, you're going to miss quite a lot about what's going on. It's a big difference compared to the way Linux works, where usually you've got your kernel and you've got your distributions. The major BSDs, be it NetBSD, FreeBSD, or Open, I don't know much about Dragonfly, so sorry, I won't talk about it all that much. But usually you have to take the whole system. It's not just the kernel. You have all sorts of stuff that use the basic mechanisms. Like, for instance, on FreeBSD, you've got their new package manager in Poudriere, which uses gels a lot. And things like that on OpenBSD, and things like that on NetBSD. You can't just talk about the kernel most of the time, or you are missing half the fun, in my opinion.
Indeed, and I do apologize for focusing way too much on my favorite obsession, namely operating system kernels. Just a quick question, because when full disclosure, I'm still using every now and then. I'm still using FreeBSD and NetBSD. My understanding, and I'm using ports as the main package manager. Apparently, there's more to package management in BSD than ports. Enlighten me, please.
I use Poudriere to build my own packages, and I run Poudriere in a jail. Basically, if you want packages that use non-default settings, basically, if you're doing make config or show config or tweaking any of the settings, each package has its own set of settings, and they have a set of default values. So if you want to change that, you can't use the project provided packages. So you either build your own packages using Poudriere or use ports. For those unfamiliar, a port is a set of files that allows you to create a package. It's like the set of meta instructions that say you get the source from here, you build it using this mechanism, you put these files there, etc. So a port allows you to create a package, but once you've got that package, something made from ports and something made from Poudriere is indistinguishable. It's the same thing. It's just two different ways of getting to the same goal. So both Poudriere and ports use the ports tree.
If I can add a bit of history, that's something that we started in OpenBSD, more or less. Like around 2005 or something like that. You had ports on all FreeBSD. And most of the time, if you wanted to have an application with current stuff, you used to have to check out the port tree, compile what you wanted, and that was it. You had everything working when you were lucky. And at about that point, Theo decided that it would be a good idea to actually have binary packages, a bit like Red Hat RPM at that point. And so we started working on making sure that when you compile stuff, you always got the same package. There was some problem compared to that, and also making sure that you could specify options in a reasonable way. I know that Dan has been working a lot on the infrastructure to make sure that you get all options and all databases related to ports correct. And then I think I was a bit early, but I started working on ways to build packages industrially on OpenBSD. And soon after that, Baptiste Daroussin did the same thing on FreeBSD with Poudrière and PackageNG. So we moved more or less to having a port system where you could compile everything by yourself, and you had to compile everything by yourself, to a binary package system where it would be easy to build the same thing, and you would only compile stuff if you really wanted to tinker with it, but you could use a binary package like on Red Hat, for instance.
I mean, this is the main difference, because if you take a look at your typical Linux distribution, apart from maybe Debian or Arch, I'm talking about the Red Hats and the Ubuntus of the world. These are backed by companies, and for example, OpenSUSE goes without saying, that have a corresponding built infrastructure in the background that basically do packaging, and that goes for CentOS and Fedora as well. I'm just kind of summarizing them under the Red Hat umbrella. Let's put it this way: how do the BSDs address these infrastructure issues?
All of the BSDs have a packaging system that descends from FreeBSD ports, but they've all diverged in very different ways and have very different feature sets. And in NetBSD, for example, it's the only BSD that doesn't actually use the term ports. In NetBSD, it's package source, and it produces, packages. And I think the infrastructure is very different across BSDs, because the different packaging systems have different focuses. For example, package source works on lots of different operating systems, and FreeBSD ports has also retained lots of customization features, but I think OpenBSD is very focused on producing binaries, so they don't put as much focus onto customizing the build or providing lots of tools for building from source, because I think that's discouraged.
That's not true at all.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We provide all the tools that you need to build from source. We do have some customizations options, but usually we do some kind of let's say distribution work. Like we have some options that you can use very easily, which are called flavors most of the time. And if you want to do something else, you can still tinker and you can still build binary packages, but you might be on your own if you run into issues. If you look at how FreeBSD and OpenBSD do stuff, we are actually very similar for one very simple reason, which is that the people who did most of the work on OpenBSD and FreeBSD ports are basically me and Baptiste Daroussin, and we talked a lot together. So we don't have the same tools, but we wrote almost everything. But we shared most of the concepts. You will find that our packaging tools are rather similar, and most of the changes that we did in OpenBSD happened in FreeBSD as well. Like having a staging area to build packages, that's one common point. Trying to have reliable dependencies and stuff like that, that's also something that we share. I know what NetBSD does. you didn't diverge all that much. The thing that maybe is the biggest difference is that it's probably easier for you to build stuff that's widely different from official binary packages without any pointers in the resulting package that something strange was going on, maybe.
Yeah.
But there are lots of common points. We all do more or less the same thing. We all use a huge makefile to build a port, for instance. And we still have more or less the same steps. You always will do make fetch, make patch, make configure, make build, and make install, more or less. So if you want to tinker with ports on all three BSD, you always have the same options at this point. After that, what you do with your ports, there might be some differences. I know we have different bulk systems.
But going back to Mark's point, that brings up a very interesting subject. If I take a look at the supported architectures, I see a significant difference between the likes of FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and NetBSD. So, for example, FreeBSD seems to concentrate mostly on Intel-based architectures, whereas OpenBSD supports many more CPU architectures. And that brings, of course, up a very interesting subject, namely, if you're distributing binary packages, who takes care of the corresponding build toolchain in terms of you have to, either you're doing cross-compiling, or somebody has to provide an infrastructure where you can package as in build packages on.
FreeBSD has a package build farm. Every set of packages gets built every 2 days or so, and it takes about that long to build the entire set of ports. There's roughly 45,000 ports, give or take a few thousand. And those are all built. Now, it varies upon what sort of architecture you get. I'm just looking at Apache here, and they build for FreeBSD 11 down to FreeBSD 14 on different packages such as ARM6, ARM7, PowerPC 64,
wow. Okay.
i386, MIPS. I may be repeating, but you can see all these packages listed, and they're all the same version. I see 2.446 and I see 2.448 on the newer ones. So it may take, once a new version is committed to the ports tree, it may take 2 to 4 days before that package is available from the FreeBSD infrastructure. But if you want to build it yourself, you just refresh your copy of the ports tree, cd user ports www Apache 2.4, make package, and you can build your own package. In my case, I had Poudriere set up to run nightly. I have a list of packages and a list of the options to use for those packages. And every night I get about 28 different trees built.
Wow.
Basically, FreeBSD 11.4, 12.2, FreeBSD 13, and a whole lot of different settings because I have different needs for different things. And that all runs overnight every night.
Interesting. Because I can recall...
Sorry, Chris, I need to go shortly.
Yes.
Been very fascinating so far. I have a couple...
Go ahead.
I have one question before I need to go. I'd like to have the panel's opinion on the single technical reason, as in, obviously, clearly not everybody is using FreeBSD out there. We have mentioned ports, we mentioned deals. What for each of the panel members would be the single technical reason to choose FreeBSD?
FreeBSD.
Well, sorry, any BSD.
You squeeze that in.
Now is the case to make the time to make the case for your version of BSD, indeed. Yeah.
By all means, people, go ahead. Yes, thank you, Martin.
Sorry, all right.
I've answered this question many times in the past, and I've summarized it for myself. in response to questions I've received. And I can't say that it's a single technical thing, but it's a combination of things, all of which are technical, which from a sysadmin's point of view makes my life much, much easier now that these technologies have come together. Number one, ZFS. I've been using it for about 10 years.
Okay.
It's been fully integrated into FreeBSD for that time. And it is the single best thing for me when it comes to using directories. I've told people that when you go to do a make dir, consider ZFS create. It's a different way of thinking of things. Should this be a separate file system? But the next thing is PKG, the packaging system. And on top of that, it's Poudriere that allows me to build my own packages with my own settings, including my own private ports, all seamlessly. And it doesn't make any difference to the operating system that they're using my packages as opposed to FreeBSD packages. And I keep thinking there was a third thing in there from memory, and I just can't remember what it was, but I'll leave it at those two.
Who wants to go next?
I can go next. I'm going to start with saying that we have more or less some of the same technical reasons, like our packaging system is about working functionally it's the same as FreeBSD, and we have build tools that work just as well. It's called DPB instead of Poudriere, but we have builds about every 3 days, official builds, and I can rebuild my whole system in about 2 days on my cluster at work. I don't have that many machines, so it takes about that time. One very nice feature of OpenBSD, which doesn't exist anywhere else for now, is called Pledge. This is probably something you haven't heard about. It is a beautiful idea for making processes commit to not doing things they should not do. Like, for instance, at the start of a program, you are going to say, I pledge to only do input-output on open files and algorithms in memory and nothing else. And after that, your process is going to get killed whenever it tries to open a new file or do a network connection. And it's very similar to stuff like GR security or Capsicum on FreeBSD. The main difference is that you don't have to specify all the system calls that you want to call or not call. You are just going to say, okay, I want to use this subsystem or that subsystem and everything. And it's beautifully interfaced with C library. And also it goes, the granularity is sometimes smaller than system calls. Like, for instance, anybody who's played with kernel knows that higher control is going to be a huge can of worms when you look at drivers and shit. And for instance, with Pledge, you can say, okay, I don't want to do anything with device drivers, but I have to handle TTYs. I need to be able to set TTYs to blocking, non-blocking, echo, whatever that stuff, and nothing else. And you can do that. More or less, we have about everything in the base system using Pledge. And all important ports have been converted to use it as well. So if you have any kind of bug, any kind of, let's say, rope chain intrusion in your software, and it tries to do something that it shouldn't do, Pledge will force it to abort in many, many cases. So as far as security goes, I think it's a very beautiful features. And I hope that at some point other people are going to port it to something else, maybe FreeBSD, maybe Linux. That would be a good idea. Even though I don't really see it happening because Linux is a jungle. It's not really something where you can actually make something happen at the time for the time being, I think.
Interesting perspective. Who wants to go next?
So I'm going for OpenBSD. From what I've been able to tell over the last few years, there's a fair number of small features in OpenBSD that have been clearly conceived probably at least in part out of a desire to kind of minimize the amount of tech support requests that get posted to MISC, the MISC mailing list, and probably other lists on that site. So things like the installer being a very step-by-step thing. I think OpenBSD is the only one that ships with window managers by default out of the BSDs. I think.
No, we have some window managers.
Possibly not. I might be wrong. Sorry, who is that?
NetBSD ships with a window manager too.
By default?
Yeah, CTWM.
Okay. So
we actually have two window managers by default. We have a CWM and the old FVWM, if I remember correctly.
But anyway, so I mean, yeah. So, but apart from that, the command line utility is very simple. I mean, anyone who's already familiar with the typical kind of Unix-like commands, like the general file system commands, will probably find OpenBSD very easy, really, in general. So
interesting.
If I can add a snide remark, when you look at macOS, usually you are looking at the kernel and saying blah blah blah, it's FreeBSD more or less. And when you look at userland and you try to start from the command line, you figure out that you got something that is hopelessly outdated. Like most commands haven't been updated for about 20 years. The man pages are crap, completely out of date and everything. The user interface, the graphical part is nice, but if you want to do any kind of actual administration, like not Windows administration, but real stuff, in my opinion, macOS is crap.
It's a very proprietary approach to something called a Unix operating system. Yes, I agree.
When you said when you look at this, you're using that. When you look at that, you're using this. It reminded me of the Netflix story. When you're selecting a movie on Netflix, when you're browsing them and looking at the little bits and pieces that describe the movie, you're on AWS. Once you press play and you're streaming a movie, that's all FreeBSD.
Yes, as a matter of fact. I think the last remaining person without pointing him out is Nia. Nia, do you want to share anything?
Yeah, I think the most standout points for NetBSD would be, from my side, would be it has excellent support for ARM as like a first-class architecture. So if you have any small ARM devices, I would recommend trying NetBSD out on them, because it's just cute and fun to use, and it's nice to try different things. We've already discussed the big technical things like ZFS, but I'd also bring up things like, say, the different firewalls the BSDs have. I've tried several of them. I think NPF is quite nice. There are lots of different firewall options if you use the BSDs. And I've already brought up all of the things like, I think NetBSD has a very good balance of performance and security features, but also I'd just say it's a good option if you want to really experience like a classic Unix system.
Okay, all of these different flavors and varieties have their pros and cons. Needless to say, Linux actually over the years has borrowed quite a few concepts from the BSDs of the world. The Berkeley packet filter comes to mind, needless to say, but that's another story for another episode. What I'm interested to hear is actually, how does the community, as in the panel present on this episode, perceive the more and more forthcoming, for want of a better expression, integration with components? Let me shell out one example. If you take a look at the GNOME project, it's more and more moving towards System D, which is one of the standard init architectures running on Linux these days. So it might be very difficult in the future to port GNOME to something called BSD. Any takes, any opinions on this?
Are you saying that in order to have GNOME, we're going to have System D?
Pretty much, if I read the writings on the wall correctly.
Speaking of writing, If anyone wants to become familiar with Systemd, they should read a book by Michael W. Lucas called Savaged by Systemd. And that should give you a good introduction to Systemd and what you can be in for if you start using it.
I would be more worried about things like GTK3 becoming dependent on Systemd, because GTK is kind of in loads of, it's in both the main web browsers and loads of other kind of graphical apps. I wouldn't say GNOME is, it's kind of nice to have on an accessibility point of view, but it's not quite the end of the world, I would say.
I don't see why software has to become reliant upon Systemd. I know Systemd is much bigger than rc.d, for example, but I don't see why software should become reliant upon rc.d. rc.d is a way to start your daemons and stop your daemons and interact with them and get them the configuration settings they need. But you can also run those daemons without rc.d.
No, that's not a problem at all, actually. I've been talking with people who are porting GNOME on OpenBSD, and it's indeed an issue. It has nothing to do with starting services. It has everything to do with stuff like looking at user configuration and shit like that. It's been traditionally very difficult on Unix systems to do that kind of stuff portably from a graphical interface. And it seems that apparently Systemd kind of makes it easier in some cases, and you are starting to have some GNOME basic libraries which are depending on this stuff to fully work. And this is indeed an issue. There was some project to try to do some kind of Systemd stub library to be able to still run all those GNOME support libraries if you are not running Systemd, but I don't know how this is going.
For GNOME currently, we're having to patch in lots of stuff that they've removed, like console kit support, which is basically portable login-D, really.
It sounds like poor design decisions.
Yeah, but we're talking GNOME and GTK. Have you looked at the code recently? Like, if you're trying to find anything in the glib code or GIMP, for instance, it's a complete nightmare. It's indirection versus indirection. And, well, for starters, doing object-oriented work in C, it's completely crazy. And Systemd is a big blob of shit as well. So, yeah, what do you expect? But more or less, it works for them, at least. And you have this, in my opinion, huge camp of Linux people who just want to be Windows.
Interesting.
So you're moving to the same kind of interface. And instead of having a huge jungle of if-defs to be able to run on anything, which used to be the case 20 years ago, if you looked at external code 20 years ago, for instance, now you have this huge blob, Systemd, which offers you some interface which say, hey, you want to look at user, you want to look at configuration, you want to look at the date and time and everything. Come on, I've got the API for that. So we are going probably to need to do something about it at some point. On the other side, I think that when it becomes necessary, there's going to be some people who are going to say, okay, it's not possible to no longer have a new GNOME version running on BSD. So yeah, we have to have some kind of stub library that works for us. And possibly we'll get something that's the best of both worlds, which means that we will still have somewhat secure systems, because Systemd is a joke. And I'm saying this seriously. What do you expect? You are going to run a whole set of things that have access to the full system as a set of shared library under root. This makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to anybody who's doing any kind of secure coding. And on the other side, you want to have a simple interface that allows you to do modern stuff that Windows has been doing for 10 years with all the security holes that entails. So maybe we'll get some shims that actually provide us with the same interface but with some amount of security. I don't know.
Leonard Pettering, if you're listening, don't go near the BSD people. Just my 2 cents on the whole story, but jokes aside.
Just in case he doesn't know, it's very definitely hated by a lot of us. It's really, it's really a shit show. I still don't understand how the Linux people managed to get that coup going and all of the shit. Come on, like the stuff about logging, starting with numbers and you can become root, and that's not his issue. Come on, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. He's not a proper developer, in my opinion.
I reckon this whole thing goes back to the fact that, okay, full disclosure for those people who don't know it, Leonard Pettering is still working for Red Hat. So I think if I recall correctly, Fedora was the first Linux that had systemd on board. There was quite a few alternatives at the time, and we're talking about 6-7 years back. Canonical had something called Upstart. The likes of Arch at the time and all the rest of the kind of other distributions were still relying on the systemd in it. But over time, people perceived the advantages of systemd, which has progressively becoming, I'm tempted to say, the Swiss Army knife of Linux for doing all sorts of things, as a main advantage with regards to packaging and kind of using functionality in terms of having a single API, as you just pointed out a couple of minutes ago, to avail of system services and to inquire about system states as the way forward. Hence, more and more distributions adopted it until such time when a few distributions said, this is not our game, enough of it, and forked. And Dev 1 in the Debian world probably would be the best example for this. But of course, the problem is that more and more subsystems, I'm tempted to say, for want of a better expression here, like GNOME and some other software and some other code bases rely on systemd to function properly. And I'm just curious, in the Linux world, GNOME has quite a steady hold with regards to desktop space. For example, Ubuntu standard desktop is based on GNOME Shell. I take it's quite different in the BSD world. Maybe somebody can shed some more light on kind of the window management aspects of BSD, and if there's any standard that the BSD people have, maybe that's worth discussing.
Well, you brought up Red Hat, and I think that's a good thing to touch on, because Red Hat are funding a lot of these very large open source projects now, which allow
best example, yes,
to coordinate changes and push things that Red Hat employees want into the open source space. I think there used to be more counterbalance there. I think Sun Microsystems used to have a lot of involvement, but of course they're dead now. And they would have, of course, if things have to run on Solaris, they have to be portable. I would, in NetBSD's case and in OpenBSD's case, we both ship Xorg as part of the system. And there's the question of what we're going to do in the future. If, say, I think a big worry for me personally is if GTK goes ahead and says, okay, we've decided that X11 is deprecated and we're going to remove support for X11 in GTK, and none of your apps work anymore. That's going to be a huge transition that we're going to have extreme difficulty with, because, well, the protocol is designed around Linux, and it has quite a lot of assumptions about Linux's input stack baked it right into it.
By the way, does Wayland run on BSD? Or on a BSD?
Yes, but with lots of shims and compatibility layers, or lots of patching.
Interesting, okay. Because this is becoming more and more the standard window manager on Linux systems.
Sorry, you said Wayland. It's a display protocol, isn't it? And then it's implemented by so-called Wayland compositors.
Sorry, yes, it's a protocol rather. Sorry, not a Windows system. Sorry. Yes, I do apologize. I probably should be more specific. It's a windowing protocol similar to X11, but without the, for example, network transparency that X11 brings to the table.
Well, I don't think that. Most people have network transparency disabled on X11 these days. In any case.
And hence the perceived need by the community for something called Wayland, because as you rightly pointed out, most people run X11 applications on their desktop, so there's no need for the performance impact, or tiny performance impact, let's put it this way, that X11 has by using a full-blown TCP IP stack. In terms of network transparency. So, and that's exactly where kind of Wayland comes into play. It's not network transparent. You can only run it locally, and it has quite a few disadvantages in comparison to X11. But more and more distros are adopting this as their main windowing protocol, let's put it this way, plus the compositing managers surrounding Wayland. The K-Winds of the world and other stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not quite sure what problems it actually solves. They are sometimes talking about security, but basically most security issues lie with the graphics card and the DRI graphics driver in any case. So you've got this big blob of untrusted code that runs on your GPU and that has access to the full memory of your machine in many cases. It bypasses DME and everything. And yeah, sure, Wayland is supposed to that each window can talk to another window unless they say so, but frankly, there are issues, security issues, they lie much deeper than that, so I'm not quite sure.
Any other opinions on this topic before we move on?
I've worked with Wayland quite closely in the process of porting it to NetBSD, and I kind of have to agree. It's too loosely defined. There are lots of protocol incompatibility issues still, and it's just not as powerful. It's like kind of just a downgrade in terms of its feature set. And X11 is the standard for Unix, and I very much hope it doesn't go away.
Interesting perspective, and maybe the Linux people should take notes.
The one feature in GNOME that I'm aware of that only exists on Wayland at the moment, I think, was like fractional scaling, where not only having, the kind of the standard, I don't know if it's even the standard, but whatever you want to call it, 96 DPI, like on x.org server, you only have, that or 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. But of course, many laptops are, probably better suited for like 1.5 times or something like that. And for whatever reason, GNOME has, is able to scale to that sort of figure on Wayland. But I don't know what's different, like on a technical side that makes that possible, but that's the only thing that I'm aware of that's different.
From what you say, it sounds more like the people who are writing the drivers for X11 haven't done the work, and that's it. I see absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to composite X11 windows to whatever ratio you want on the graphics card. You have enough memory for it, it's fast enough, your GPU is going to do all of the work. They already do that for video all the time these days, so just implement it and it should work. I mean,
pull requests, I take it, are being accepted. Okay, that has been more than interesting. Final question from my side, because we are rapidly approaching the 3-hour mark. No, I'm joking, but I reckon, where do you see this whole BSD thing going in terms of OpenBSD, FreeBSD, and NetBSD? And we haven't even touched on the for example, on the security advantages of something called OpenBSD, but we're going to leave it at that. So, final question: the road ahead, especially in the light of the mounting adoption, let's put it this way, over the last 5 to 10 years of Linux on an enterprise basis, especially if you take a look at something called other people's computers, also commonly known as the cloud.
BSD is dying. Netcraft confirms it.
Sweet and short, okay. Maybe there are additional opinions or maybe elaborations of that remark.
I think people have been saying that BSD is dying for the past 30 years. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. We'll be around long into the future, and we'll keep attracting new users and lots of interest into the future because people like different things. People don't like monocultures.
Yeah. Like IBM mainframes, more or less. No, I'm joking, but you know what I mean. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, but there's more or less that specific point, which is that I don't think that lots of people are going to use OpenBSD directly in the future. We're more or less an experimental OS. Everything works for me, and I'm fine with it. But I know that we have some limitations, like our symmetric multiprocessing is not quite up to par yet, and sometimes we support hardware better than other systems. At some point, we were better on Wi-Fi than Linux. Yeah, seriously, 10 years ago, that was more or less the case.
No surprises there.
We still do interesting developments and build pieces of software that you end up using wherever you are. Like the most famous instance, of course, is OpenSSH. But you have some other pieces of OpenBSD on your system. It took a lot of time, but STL copy is everywhere these days. Finally, when finally Ulrich Draper left the Linux kernel and the glibc, it finally invaded Linux as well. And some other experiments which are used elsewhere. On a more systematic basis between BSDs, even though we are different systems, we do talk to each other and we spy on whatever is going on the other OSs. So,
okay.
Yeah, yeah. We look at commits, and it's all under a BSD license. So you just have to put the proper attribution, and you can steal whatever fuck you want, and it's just okay. It's how it's supposed to be done. So we are still moving forward, and I think that from time to time, Linux and other systems do steal from us. I seem to remember that at some point in the past, Windows stole our whole network stack, for instance.
Mark, I think the word that you're looking for is collaboration, not spying. But that's just my personal opinion.
Whatever, it's more or less the same. Sometimes you collaborate without actually talking to each other. You just look at the commits and say, "Hey, that's a good idea. I could probably reuse that." And when you're nice enough, you send an email to say, "Thank you. It was a really, really nice piece of code, and we are going to make good use of it."
I mean, you do have exchanges between the Linux world and the OpenBSD world, and OpenSSH probably is probably the best example for this, or OpenSSL for that matter. Any other takes on this subject?
Code sharing, as mentioned, is really the answer here. And I think that in the Linux community, there's this real fear of forking and this kind of paranoia that as soon as a piece of software is forked, then the effort is going to be split and everyone's going to suffer as a result. But I think we kind of, with the amount that the BSDs are sharing and getting from each other, I think that's not really true. Not everyone wants to eat the same flavor of chocolate.
The problem with Linux is somewhat different, in my opinion. I think that it has more to do with binary compatibility and commercial issues. Like some parts of Linux are actually completely stale. Like these days, as far as I know, it's impossible to add a new system call to Linux because it would break everything binary-wise. And you have enough companies with vested interests in keeping binaries running that some parts of Linux are getting really hard to change. And we don't have this kind of problem. most of the time.
Well, you don't have a benevolent dictator for life, right? Sorry, there are, of course, kernel maintainers on the Linux side, but at the end of the day, Linux is still calling the shots. This is not the case in the BSD ecosystem, is it? Because you all pretty much do your own thing.
We have a dictator in OpenBSD.
Sorry?
We have a dictator in OpenBSD.
Oh, you do?
It's
Okay.
well known. Yeah,
I see.
Dirat, come on. You disagree with him, you're usually out of a project if you disagree violently enough.
I think FreeBSD has the reputation of being the longest continuously in charge. It's had the most number of teams. I'm trying to think of the proper word. Governance. The longest continuously governed project, I think. It's long had a core team that was more or less in charge of everything. It has a very good transition, and that just keeps rolling over.
Just out of curiosity, the kernel code base between the different BSDs is the same?
No.
Nope.
So you all have your own kernels, okay.
Oh, yes.
Yes. We have some shared code, like you are going to find some drivers which are mostly the same from one BSD to the next.
Okay.
And we have the same ancestors, like for instance, our all file system, UFS and FFS, it's mostly the same code. Some of us in OpenBSD are still scratching our hair trying to figure out what Marshall McCusick did a long time ago, for instance.
Okay.
But we diverge a great deal. If you look at any BSD code, you will more or less recognize the same things, but there are common parts, there are differences. Different kernels, different userland, common ancestry, let's say.
Just out of curiosity, because Linux has one trait, and this is the reason why Richard M. Stallman still likes to call it GNU/Linux, because the userland, in terms of at least the command line, is heavily dependent on GNU software. If memory serves correct, you are still using GCC as a standard compiler on BSD, but what about the rest? You're not?
No,
okay.
Stop.
No.
Recently.
We've been on C-Lang for about 5 years, I think.
Right. Okay. I know that Apple made that move quite some time ago, but I wasn't too sure about the rest of the BSD ecosystem. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, because of why? Because of technical superiority, or why? Why did you make that move?
Because of the license. Because the FSF they tried to pull the fast one when we moved to GPL v3 and OpenBSD got fucked. We had to stick with GCC 4.2.1 for a very long time because it was the last compiler, GCC compiler with GPL v2 license. And finally, we were able to move to C-Lang on most architectures. We still ship GCC, let's say, as a backup compiler. Let's say if you want to debug stuff and it works slightly differently so that you can find some differences, but at least on Intel processors, everything is compiled with C-Lang these days.
Okay.
And linked with LLVM linker as well.
Interesting.
We have moved completely away from GCC.
Wow. And what about the rest of the userlands, like standard utilities like ls, move, or whatever? Or there's a BSD star, of course. But what about
at least on OpenBSD, most everything is BSD licensed. There is Perl in our base system, but we are not using it under the GPL license since it's dual license, and you've got the artistic license, which is very close to the BSD license. I think that from the start, one of the goals of OpenBSD was to have everything under an acceptable license, and if not possible, we would resort to GPL v2. And at some point, the whole running system was BSD with a compiler being GPL and stuff like that. And I think that these days we have managed to have more or less the base running system is more or less entirely BSD, I think.
And what
the
about
toolchain is
yeah.
BSD.
And what about the other BSDs? Same userland? Like all code bases, essentially BSD licensed?
Yes, essentially everything bar a few things. We don't have as much of a strict licensing policy as OpenBSD, and we use GCC because some processor architectures we support are only supported by GCC.
Okay.
But apart from the tool chain, basically everything is BSD MIT under similar licenses.
Interesting.
I just checked FreeBSD 13 and a FreeBSD 12.2 host here, and they both are running CLang version 10 and CLang, I missed it, CLang 11.01, respectively. Sorry.
No, that's a very interesting perspective because, as I said, Linux is pretty much dominated by the GNU userland, and of course, the GNU code bases are GPL licensed, as is the Linux kernel, of course.
It also means that when it comes time to make a kernel decision, you're not worried about breaking userland because it's your userland. You don't have to worry about all the different distros breaking, because you can fix it right here and now and move on with life.
I mean, there are no such things as OpenBSD distributions, right? There's an OpenBSD, there's a FreeBSD, and there's NetBSD, and that's about it. In Linux,
from time to time, you have people who are trying to make some derivative distributions. I don't know if PCBSD still exists. You have some, but you might have some derivative distributions, but more or less there is one official distribution, and that's it.
There's something called Hello System, which I think is FreeBSD based, and you said PCBSD. I think that's it renamed. That's from IX Systems, isn't it? Didn't they rename themselves True OS? Or, I'm not sure. It also reminded me of Frisbee, FRESBIE. I think Max ran that, and it allowed you to create your own bootable ISO of FreeBSD with other things you wanted in it.
Interesting. Okay.
The nomenclature of distributions and the GNU Linux naming dispute both of them seem to be a symptom of a debate as to whether Linux itself should actually be called an operating system itself, because, I mean, one could easily make the argument that, Debian is an operating system, Fedora is an operating system, Ubuntu is an operating system, rather than distributions is a name that just seems to have arisen because Linux is referred to as an operating, or at least a family of operating systems, and there just needed to be another term to differentiate everything that's based on it.
I mean, that's a very interesting perspective, because if you take a close look at the history of Linux, I mean, it started out as a terminal emulator, and then Linux took a close look at Minix and didn't like it. So the rest is on Usenet and the operating system wars and all the rest of it. Kids, the links maybe in the show notes, depending on whether I'm up to it or not. But at some stage, basically, big enterprise moved in, the Red Hats and the other people and the Canonicals of the world. And not before long, you had a set of standards like the file system hierarchy, the Linux standard base, and all the rest of it that almost all distributions adhere to. And of course, you had big money in the shape of Red Hat and Canonical moving into that market. Mark Shuttleworth took a close look at Debian, liked it, and that's essentially the basis for Ubuntu these days. Now, Red Hat still has this playground called Fedora. I won't go into the CentOS debacle because that Inlaws is not a CentOS show. But yes, never mind the Linux Foundation. if you take a look at their sponsoring page, who's a member and what money flows into that organization, this is clearly big business moving in. And I reckon this is, at least from a commercial perspective, the main difference between the BSDs of the world and Linux, because Linux these days is all about enterprise deployments. The cloud, containers, and all the rest of it all runs Linux.
I was going to say, Android apparently isn't a Linux distribution, or at least it doesn't seem to be commonly known as one anyway. It seems to be able to just stand on its own, even though, I mean, okay, it's kind of a rolling, from what I'm aware of, it's kind of a rolling fork of its version of Linux is kind of is more different than most other OS's implementation of Linux anyway. So apparently it's not generally referred to as a Linux distro, but then where is everyone supposed to draw the line?
Indeed, Patrick. I was just going to touch upon this because if you take a close look at the system architecture of something called Android, you still have a full-blown Linux kernel underneath it. But the rest of the user land, and that's exactly your main differentiator here, is quite different. You have a different inner system. You have something called Zygote that is actually in charge of spinning up processes. I'm simplifying things, of course. And then you have this main driver called JVM. Sorry, it's not called JVM. It's ART or it's Dalvik or whatever you want to call it these days. It depends on your Android version. But at the end of the day, the commonality is something called the AOSP, the Android Open Source Project, because that's exactly the code base that Google couldn't make proprietary, or Android for that matter, because it's all GPL licensed. And if you actually have a phone in front of you, if you manage to connect this phone to a computer, if you turn on, with a USB cable, for example, if you turn on USB debugging on this phone, you still have a command line in front of you once you invoke ADB shell. And ADB, of course, standing for the Android debugging bridge. So at the very core, it's still a Linux system. Mostly GPL licensed, and similar to, or I'm almost tempted to say, similar to the OS X architecture, the rest is proprietary crap. Namely, the stuff basically that Google put on top in terms of the user interface, the virtual machine that executes Java, bytecode, and all the rest of it.
Is it still going to be Linux in the future? It seems like Google is getting sick of Linux and they're moving towards their own thing, Fuchsia.
Yes, Fuchsia is a different story. Google has copped on to the fact that AOSP has one significant disadvantage. It's licensed because it's Linux at the end of the day. It's licensed under GPL, whereas Fuchsia actually, I think, is licensed under BSD or MID license, which is much more permissive. So the smartphone manufacturers who basically take the OSP and the Google ecosystem running on top of it and do something themselves with it. Like, for example, Samsung has their own user interface. I can't even recall what it's called. But if you take a close look at quite a few smartphone manufacturers, they all do their own thing. And I reckon with the dominance of Google in the Android market, Tyson, thank you very much. With the dominance of a company called Google in the smartphone market, this is essentially the driver that made them basically do their own thing in terms of coming up with a much more permissive licensed operating system base going forward than basically the smartphone manufacturers could use, not to be bound by the GPL under which the majority of the AOSP code base is licensed. It's just a matter of time, I reckon, before you see that switch happening from the AOSP, which, as I said, is mostly Linux-based, to something called Fuchsia.
I would like to see Android phones get security updates faster or at all. There doesn't seem to be a long life for a given Android phone. It's upgraded.
Yeah, it's a B2C market. I mean, you're looking at about what, maybe a year, maybe 2 years of the shelf life of a smartphone, because after that it's being replaced by something else. So why bother?
No. I disagree. I still have iPhone 5s and iPhone 7s that are perfectly functional, and they still receive updates.
Yes, but that's Apple. That's not Google. Or that's not Samsung. Or that's not Motorola or something.
This is why I specifically mentioned Android.
Yes.
Did you hear about Pegasus?
I didn't hear what you said.
Pegasus.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, especially iOS and.
Can you maybe, for the two people in the audience who do not know what Pegasus is, maybe you can elaborate, please, Mark?
Oh, it's big news these days. Like we just found out that some Israeli people have been using Pegasus to spy on journalists in France and in other places, among other things. And as far as I remember, they have been using 0 days on iOS phones. So,
I think both Android and iOS systems are affected.
Yeah, but both are affected more or less because this is still stuff with closed source software. I don't mean that open source is perfectly safe, but if you can't even look at the software, you have absolutely no reason to think that it's going to be secure, especially when you're looking at state spying on each other.
I mean, that's a whole different debate, but maybe subject for another show.
I don't see how you can trust a phone that's manufactured by the United States or Korea to be perfectly safe, or China for that matter.
Buy your own kit and do your own OS running on top of that kit. Just make sure that you have the blobs in place for the SoC. This
is not something you can do specifically because you have blobs.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes.
How much longer is it going to be possible to install your OS, and how long will it take for them to decide it's too unsafe to allow users that much freedom?
Good question.
This is precisely why we should be continuing to be doing what we do and fight for it, so that this doesn't ever happen, that you can still tinker and do your own OS and do your own hardware and do open source stuff.
That's, I reckon, precisely the difference between something called the BSDs of the world, as in these days, not back in the olden days, and something called Linux. Apart maybe from a few corners in the Linux empire that still think along the same lines, I might add.
To answer the question, Pegasus is a spyware that was created by an Israeli cyber arms firm called NSO Group. And it can be covertly installed on mobile phones and other devices. I'm reading from the Wikipedia page.
Both iOS as well as Android systems, yes.
And it was first discovered, let me see here. I had this, discovered in August 2018.
Okay, guys. Unfortunately, we have to wrap this up because we have been recording now for almost 1.5 hours. No worries. Any final statements before we close off the show?
I have one, but I'll go last.
Okay. Fair enough. Any prior takers?
I would just like to say, run BSD, stop fascism.
Yeah. Fair enough. Any other takers before the last statement?
I think I've been doing enough trolling for tonight, so just try BSD and see if you like it.
I really haven't heard any trolling today. None whatsoever.
Run BSD, stop fascism.
Yes. It's all free opinions and all the rest of it, yes. Yep. Now for the very final remark, Dan.
I want to correct something in my opening statement. I started with open source software in 1998, not 1995. If you want to have a better overview of the history of BSD, I suggest you look for a YouTube video called A Narrative History of BSD by Dr. Kirk McCusick. That will get you well into the door. If you want to hear more about a BSD perspective on systemd, look for a YouTube video by Benno Rice called The Tragedy of Systemd. Mm-hmm. And if you want to look at how much BSD is evolving, go back 10 years, look at the size of the dev teams, go now, look at the size of the dev teams. Dev teams don't increase without interest. People join dev teams because they are interested in the product and they want to work on the product. And that's how you keep a project self-sustaining, is by having a growing user community and development community.
Strong words, softly spoken, I'm tempted to add.
I'd just like
Guys,
to actually be serious for a moment. And I referenced a talk earlier called The Rise and Fall of Copyleft by Robert Ladley. And if the audience is particularly interested in the history of open source and of copyrights and licenses, I'd recommend listening to it.
Details of all of these projects and pointers, of course, will be in the show notes. People, first of all, a big thank you to the panel. That has been more than interesting, especially given the fact that this is probably an outsider's take on the whole Linux ecosystem. That has been more than refreshing, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for participating. And with that, I would like to close the show. Thank you very much for being on the panel, being part of something called Linux Inlaws, and maybe we get another show on the BSD ecosystem in a few years' time, and we'll have you on another show. And thank you for participating. This is the Linux Inlaws.
You come for the knowledge,
but stay for the madness.
Thank you for listening.
This podcast is licensed under the latest version of the Creative Commons license, Tab Attribution Share Alike. Credits for the intro music go to Blue Sea Roosters for the song Salute Margot, to Twin Flames for their piece called The Flow, used for the segment intros, and finally to Celestial Ground for their song Sweet Justice, used by the Dark Side. You find these and other ditties licensed under Creative Commons at Jamendo, a website dedicated to liberate the music industry from choking copyright legislation and other crap concepts. Hey guys,
What is your name?
Sorry, my name is Chris.
Because you're up as Marshall McCusick.
Yes, that was a joke.
Okay. Because when I first saw that, I said, okay, Kirk is here. What's going on?
Yeah, I just jumped when I saw the user list.
Yeah, but this is not Kirk. It's not the same voice. Come on.
Yeah, but his name could have been Marshall McCusick.
So BSD, although I'm not using it on a regular basis, has been with me for the last 40 years easily. 30 years.
I used some Unix somewhere in university, and I can't really remember much about it.
Yeah, my first Unix machine was in 1987, and I think the Sun OS 0.3, that was probably 1988 or something like that.
Interesting. That was actually in 87. That was the first time when I compiled an Emacs version on something called Solaris. Or Sun OS, it was then called.
Sun OS, yeah.
And that
Solaris
was
still a few years in the future.
Sun OS, sorry. And that was actually my introduction to something called free and open source software. Back in 87. I've been using open source software ever since.
The concept is great. The GPL is not so great. Let's say.
You see, Richard M. Stallman may think differently about this.
I'm not really concerned about what that gentleman thinks.
Gentleman?
Calling him a gentleman might be a bit of a stretch.
Do I know how to troll or what?
Bye.
Keep trolling, Mark. Don't stop.
No problem.
You've been listening to Hacker Public Radio at hackerpublicradio.org. We are a community podcast network that releases shows every weekday, Monday through Friday. Today's show, like all our shows, was contributed by an HPR listener like yourself. If you ever thought of recording a podcast, then click on our contribute link to find out how easy it really is. Hacker Public Radio was founded by the Digital Dog Pound and the Infonomicon Computer Club and is part of the binary revolution at binrev.com. If you have comments on today's show, please email the host directly, leave a comment on the website, or record a follow-up episode yourself. Unless otherwise stated, today's show is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 license.